Okay, so the FCC has just voted to repeal Title II net neutrality regulations by a vote of 3-2 along party lines. I've been one of the people who have been in favor of that direction, which puts me very much in the minority, and I've continued to receive a whole lot of comments, many of them pretty negative and pointed. And so I wanted to make this quick response, really not to gloat over this vote, but rather to explain a little bit why I'm cautiously optimistic that this might be an okay thing. And also I want to respond to many of the comments that I've received. Usually I script my videos out very carefully in the interest of being efficient and being aware of your time. I'm just responding off the cuff here, so I apologize if there's jump cuts or if it sounds like I'm stammering about a lot, but I just wanted to get this out real quickly and kind of give you my initial response to things. So the first thing I want to say is, everybody please just calm down a little bit in regards to the whole net neutrality issue. It feels to me that the level of emotion that's involved in this is way out of line with what we're talking about. The degree of regulation that we're comfortable with on the internet, whether we want the old framework that went from 1996 all the way to 2015 with some changes along the way, or the more heavy-handed Title II regulations that were put into place in 2015. So I've often wondered, why is it that people are so worked up, so emotional about this? And a lot of it seems to me like it was prompted by comedians like John Oliver. I mean, so I sometimes watch John Oliver, and I think that he can be funny, but I keep in mind that John Oliver is a comedian and not a journalist. John Oliver gets a lot of things wrong when you go back and fact check him. In fact, I'd like to remind people of, John Oliver, way back when Donald Trump was considering a run for the presidency, he encouraged him to do that because he thought it would be a hoot. In fact, he said he would be the first one to donate to his campaign. And then, of course, Trump did run. And then towards the end, coming up to election day, and everybody thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, well, then there was John Oliver again, taunting Donald Trump, offering him his Emmy if he would just take the bet that Donald Trump would accept the election outcome. Everybody laughed at this. But you gotta wonder, who's laughing now, John? So I should probably point out that I didn't vote for Donald Trump and I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. I voted for Gary Johnson because he was closest to my own political opinions, even though he's imperfect and there were a lot of issues I had with him. But when it was the choice between the lesser of two evils, the worst candidate in history and the second worst candidate in history, I decided it's probably worthwhile to vote for a candidate that I mostly believed in, even though I knew full well he was going to lose. So for those of you who haven't seen my other videos, just real quickly, the Title I framework that existed from 96 until 2015 was called a light touch regulation. And really it was kind of a tag team regulation where both the FTC and the FCC were keeping an eye on what ISPs were doing. And then when they saw that there was a problem, they might investigate or get involved. And then what changed in 2015 is that we moved over to Title II regulation, which took the FTC out of the picture, moved it so that everything would go through the FCC, with the idea that with the more heavy regulation, ISPs wouldn't be able to get away with as much as people perceived they might have been doing back under Title I. So at the end of the day, I think we're talking about a difference in regulatory frameworks. Under Title I, it's more about ISPs interacting more directly with their consumers with oversight from both the FCC and the FTC, and that's what seems to have worked pretty well for the history of the internet. On the other hand, under Title II, it's all about the government, bureaucrats, and regulators deciding what is best for consumers as they see fit. So if you're one of these people who takes as evidence this long list of things that ISPs have done in the past as a reason that we need Title II regulation, I'd just like to point out that all of those things on that list, at least anything from 1996 all the way until 2015, were successfully resolved under the existing Title I regulations. In a way, what you're saying is, look at this long list of all the things that Title I successfully fixed. I feel like you're almost making the case for keeping Title I because they were addressing these issues under Title I. Title II, the more heavy-handed regulation, may prevent those things from cropping up in the first place, but you need to ask yourself, what's the trade-off? I feel that a lot of the concerns about what may happen under a return to Title I are being hyped up. A lot of people are saying, oh, hey, ISPs are now going to charge you piecemeal for everything you're going to do. They're going to charge you for email. They're going to charge you separately for YouTube. They're going to charge you for Netflix. They're going to kind of bundle all these packages. And I just want to say, why do you think this? They didn't do it prior to 2015. And really, it's not in their best interest to start doing it now. What is in the ISP's best interest is to have packages that appeal to consumers. And so what they may offer is fast lanes for things like Netflix or for Hulu, and I think fast lanes are not necessarily a bad thing. There's kind of this packet envy thing that goes on where people are afraid that, oh, those packets are being shuttled by more quickly than mine, and that makes me upset. But if you think about it, streaming data, streaming a movie is more bandwidth intensive than is an email. I think it's actually a good idea to have some way to indicate which packets are more important that they get to the consumer quickly versus ones that it's okay if there's a little bit of latency or lag there. Something else that comes up frequently is this comparison between the absence of net neutrality and how Portugal has structured their various internet services. As Snopes has pointed out, this comparison isn't fair, that it actually doesn't represent how things work. Portugal actually does have some net neutrality laws in place, but for a variety of reasons, as you can read in the article, it's not a good comparison at all. So even though it may be that you and I disagree on whether Title I or Title II is better for the internet, I think we probably agree as it relates to kind of the big three elements that are usually defined as part of net neutrality. The first one being transparency. Transparency holds up under both Title I and under Title II, and so there's no real threat to transparency even though we've moved back to Title I. The second is no blocking. I think it's important to remember that under Title I, there are very few, if any, instances of ISPs actually blocking websites or blocking content. Your ISP is a broadband provider. They're really just interested in the data packets that get served. They really don't care as much about the content generally. They just care about the bandwidth, right? So historically, the ones who have been involved in censorship are a lot of the ones who've been on the Title II support side. Groups like Facebook, YouTube, which is owned by Google, Twitter, and all these guys have a vested interest in the Title II because they like having their data packets being pushed through the ISPs, irrespective of how much bandwidth their particular content is pushing through. Blocking is not a major issue. The third one, and this is where I think people get all worked up, is on the no throttling or the fast lanes, depending upon how you want to look at it. And we can see an instance of this in the John Oliver piece where Comcast temporarily slowed down some of the traffic coming out of Netflix as a way to bring Netflix to the negotiating table. We do know that there is a history of this. Under Title II, the idea was that everybody would have to move their packets through the internet at the same speed, that it would be regulated to enforce that. If you think of it like a freeway, as you've often seen used in various graphics, the government comes in and says, all right, there is no fast lane here on this freeway. Everybody's going to move at exactly the same speed. You can't pass anybody else. Everybody moves 45 miles an hour or whatever the setting is, and we're all going to just get there together. Under Title I, the opportunity exists for ISPs to provide fast lanes. I know that there's been a lot of, well, they're going to make you pay for this. Well, they may make you pay for it, but it's also possible that because ISPs are competing with one another for your business dollars, maybe we don't pass that cost on to consumers. Maybe it's just something that Netflix does as the cost of business, which is historically what has happened. These big content providers will actually strike a deal with their internet service providers to assure that their bandwidth usage is actually preferentially treated. Under the new transparency guidelines that will be in place, the FTC, the ones who are advocates for consumers, have stated very clearly that an ISP that throttles may be committing fraud, because if they've made promises to their consumers that they will not throttle, that they have an expectation of certain bandwidth speeds, if the ISP then does throttle and the FTC finds out about it, well, they can get in trouble. So I think because of the transparency law, the issue of throttling isn't likely to be a major problem. Also, as somebody who plays games, I like the idea that maybe an ISP will come up with some sort of program that says, hey, we've got a special thing now for gamers which reduces latency and lag so that your gaming experience is improved. I'd be willing to pay an extra $4 or $5 a month. Under Title II regulations, I don't think that this is an option. Under Title I regulations, it's something that we could at least consider, and I think that would be to the benefit of consumers. I think we should keep in mind that ISPs may offer various fast lanes without charging the consumer anything more, that instead they're offering them as a way to entice consumers to come over and use their service. We see this quite a bit now in the mobile space, so I don't see any reason not to think that they wouldn't also do it in the home space. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that PSA Sitch video. Probably about 30 different people have sent me that particular link. I've watched it. I've actually corresponded just a tiny bit on Twitter with PSA Sitch, and I think his video is, entertaining, very well put together. That being said, I think he's off on a few things. PSA Sitch really kind of just goes after Ajit Pai and makes him out to be this villainous figure, but I think that a lot of what PSA Sitch said in there wasn't quite accurate. For example, the number one thing that he says that Ajit Pai lied about was that Pai said the internet was completely unregulated before 2015. Well, I don't think Pai has ever said that. What he has said is that the regulations were light and that under Title II they became much more heavy. So it's not a binary option. It's not a false dichotomy of no regulation and all regulation. It's a matter of degree. How much regulation are we comfortable with? And so when Pai talks about support of the free markets, he was talking about the sense that under Title I, free markets were allowed to operate more freely than they are under Title II. But he's very much aware of all the issues. In fact, if you look at Ajit Pai's FCC article that he wrote announcing that they were going to look into the Title II regulations, he says very clearly that he wants to go back to Title I level of regulations and that he feels that it's important to get the FTC involved once again. Also on the topic of Ajit Pai, it comes up quite often in my comments, notes along the lines of, hey, did you know he worked for Verizon? Yes, I do know he worked for Verizon. He was a lawyer there for a few years, and he hasn't tried to hide that. It's actually on his profile page. But what I'd like to point out is that, first of all, it's not that big of a deal if somebody works both in public service and in private service. It's good to be both sides of it. And that many of the other people who work for the FCC have also been on both sides of the wall. If you look at the current commissioners, one of them used to run a newspaper for about 14 years. Two others have also been lawyers dealing with communications issues. If you look at Thomas Wheeler, who was the chairman who instituted the Title II regulations, he was actually a lobbyist for cable TV for years before he came into the FCC. Having this experience in both the public sector and the private sector isn't necessarily a bad thing. Many big internet companies have been opposed to the Title I regulations and in favor of the Title II. But have you given much thought to why those content providers would be more interested in the Title II regulations? I mean, why would YouTube and Twitter and Netflix say, hey, we like the Title II thing? So let me suggest to you that that's actually in their best interest because they are the content providers. They don't have to build infrastructure to support high levels of content that they're pushing out. All they have to do is provide the content, and then it's up to the ISP to get it from them to you as the consumer. They like the idea that they don't have to work with ISPs to cut some sort of deal for their higher bandwidth requirements because the FCC has come in and said, hey, you have to treat all data packets the same. And so if Netflix is burning up all the bandwidth on this, well, it's up to the ISP to broaden their bandwidth to make sure it all gets through at the same speed, and Netflix doesn't have to do anything about it. On the other hand, if you look at it from the ISP's perspective, they may say 80% of our bandwidth is over here being used by Netflix. Shouldn't Netflix be at least partly responsible for the bandwidth that they're using? So another thought that has come to mind as I've thought about this is, do you guys remember back in about 2012 when there was all this hubbub about the SOPA and PIPA acts that were then being proposed? Now, these were acts that were supposed to help prevent piracy and protect the intellectual property of, say, music companies or films. There was pretty much a universal outcry for, no, don't come in and regulate our internet to try and stop piracy. I feel like we were all in agreement that that would be a bad thing. But then we come around to this new Title II regulation, and a lot of people switch sides. Now they're like, oh, we were against government regulation on SOPA and PIPA, but we're all in favor of it if you're going to go stick it to the ISPs. Now, I've stated this several times that I'm very open to the possibility that I could be wrong about all this. Maybe in a couple years, it turns out ISPs have turned into absolute monsters and we're completely in this ISP dystopia that everybody seems to be worried about. In that case, I'll be on your side and get Title II regulations implemented again. But at the same time, I don't feel like it's going to be necessary. I feel that with the transparency that has already been held up in the court of law, with the FTC back in there saying they're willing, ready, and able to investigate claims of fraud, with the FCC still in play, watching over things, I think that we're actually going to see a boom in the internet. So based on where we are right now, I'd say that the situation requires for some vigilance, maybe some cautious optimism that things might get better, and that we kind of step back, relax a little bit, and as I would like to say, keep calm and game on.